I want to acknowledge that we are delivering the webinar on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and to emerging leaders. I also extend that respect to all elders across Australia and any First Nations people joining us here today. Today, we are excited to kick off this series with a discussion that holds significant importance, I think, to the youth sector. It's the 10-year anniversary of the definition of youth work in Australia. But a bit of housekeeping before we get into the conversation. I just wanted to first note and make sure everyone was aware that this is being recorded for people that might be interested or can't attend today, and closed captions are an option if you need it. During the session, we encourage you to use the Q&A chat function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You can post as yourself, or you can also post anonymously if you'd prefer. And if you see a comment reflected that you particularly want to prioritise or something that you're really keen to hear about, simply like it to upvote it. We are going to start with some prepared questions for Tim, just to set the scene, and then we'll throw to the audience via Zoom for Tim to answer those questions. We might not be able to get to all the questions, of course. And for those of you that know Tim, he is a bit of a talker. So we'll do our best, but as we're going to record it, we're going to keep the chat as well, and we are going to share those with Tim. So we may be able to answer your questions after the session as well. But for anyone who isn't familiar with AYAC's definition of youth work, I just wanted to take you on a bit of a brief journey. Just over 10 years ago, AYAC embarked on a significant endeavour in collaboration with state youth peak bodies and the youth work sector to develop a national definition of youth work in Australia. The need for a clear definition was highlighted by the sector, considering challenges such as declining education and training and a lack of shared identity for youth workers. A lot of work was done over many months to inform the development of this definition, and it involved research, a consultation paper, and meetings with the sector. It all culminated in a literal youth work lockdown at an AYAC conference in Adelaide, where representatives from the Australian youth sector were literally locked in a room until a definition of youth work was agreed upon. The AYAC definition of youth work was released in 2013, and it's a real achievement to celebrate in the development of Australian youth work sector. The definition serves as a guiding principle for the practice of youth work, emphasising the importance of prioritising young people's interests and fostering empowerment, participation and connectedness. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. I'm sure many of you are already very familiar with Tim, but Professor Tim Corney is one of the definition's co-authors, and he has a long-standing history with AYAC. He served on the board on 3 separate occasions, which is pretty impressive. Tim's extensive experience in youth work, academia, policy and advocacy makes him uniquely positioned to shed light on the current landscape of youth work and the journey since the inception of the definition. But as I've mentioned already, for those of you that know Tim, you will be well aware that he's a very passionate speaker who has a wealth of knowledge. And unfortunately, it is my job to keep him on time today. So please forgive me if I'm nudging him along a little bit as best as I can. So Tim, I was at the infamous youth work lockdown. I was one of the people locked in the room. But the memories that have stayed with me aren't so much about the definition itself and what's in the definition. Like I'm familiar with the document, but to that point in time for me, the things that I recall, it's more about the atmosphere in the room. So the recollections that I've shared recently with others as we've come towards this event and we've been talking about it, it really describes a somewhat heated room with some very passionate and engaged people present. And I think this quote kind of sums it up well for me. There were politics, heated opposition and support in equal measure. By pushing through the division to create a definition, it helped those outside the youth sector to understand and celebrate the vital role youth workers play. And I have to agree with that because it was quite a day, I think, is how I put it. But Tim, can you tell us a bit more about the background that led to the creation of the youth work definition, and why did we even need this definition and how did it come about?
Thanks, Jo. It's so great to be here, and please just let me quickly acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Yeah, look, it was an amazing time and an amazing outcome. I remember, those meetings where, people were very passionate, had very passionate views about what youth work was and how we should define it. And I suppose the first thing to say is I think what we ended up with was something very special. And so it's so great to celebrate 10 years on. The uniqueness of that definition. It's probably what you might describe as a minimalist definition. It's not maximalist. It doesn't include everything that youth work could be, but it was what we could all agree on and sign up to. The actual document itself, it's really helped reading because there were particular words that we all were, and literally there was years and months leading up to it, but where we had debates about, the word empowerment, for instance, one of the words that people were very keen to use was agency, but many of us felt empowerment was a broader term and encompassed more than just sort of individual agency. It was a sort of a way of thinking about young people collectively and thinking about young people's role in structural social change. So there was passionate debate about even particular words. Human rights was very, very important because of what was happening in the broader political context, both in states and in the federal arena. And I'm really happy to talk more about that. But remember, we've been through this whole period of an unfunded peak and then a funded peak and then back into, an unfunded peak. And look, let me say right from the outset how fantastic it is to have a refunded peak again and to have you, Joe and Katie, both of you with such, deep connections and commitment to the youth sector actually running the national peak again. So, that's something to celebrate today as well.
Tim, I'm just wondering about the actual lead up to the event. So was there general agreement that a definition was needed and that we needed,
there was.
needed
absolutely.
something defining to bring us together?
Yeah, look, there've been long debates, 30 years that I can remember, about what's youth work, what do youth workers do, how are they different to social workers or welfare workers or teachers. There was a real discussion about professionalisation, and some people were wary of professionalisation, were concerned about what that would mean. Would youth workers end up wearing white coats and stethoscopes and be, diagnosing young people if we became professionals? And professionalisation, we really needed to think about what that meant. So there's a lot of talk about codes of ethics during that time, and various states were moving towards codes of ethics and so on. So that was happening. Of course, there'd been royal commissions into the abuse of children, young people in care in institutions, and so that there were child safety commissioners and commissioners for children and young people being appointed in states and federally. So that was informing the process, sitting behind it. We needed to reassure the public that youth workers were doing good things and were able to operate safely with young people. So all of that was sitting in behind it as well.
And in terms of, I remember, it was a big room in Adelaide at the conference, and I think it was a little bit competitive to even be in the room because it had limited capacity. And so there must have been quite a lot of buy-in from people, generally across the sector. I felt at the time the sector seemed to be at quite a strong point in a lot of ways, because we did have a funded peak and we were having, professional development opportunities at the national level. But it must have, to have the atmosphere that I remember and that other people have had recollections on, there must have been a lot of buy-in and ownership.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think that's right, and a lot of goodwill. We'd had a number of meetings, prior to Adelaide, and I remember one in New South Wales and Sydney, where we were really fleshing out very early on a rough draft, and it was at that point, I think we went for a couple of days, and there was a point in that meeting where most of the state peak bodies were represented at that meeting. I was there representing Victorian peak, YACVIC, and I remember at some point we just had to say, hey, we're not going to get to a final draft here unless we put aside some of our egos and our politics here, and we really go, this is for the good of the sector, and what are we able to agree on? What can we compromise on here? And really boil it down. And that was a really important turning point, I think, in the process. And that then went into Adelaide and coming together, which I think is just a it's been a wonderful achievement, I think, and actually, as the years have gone by, its significance has grown. And I could talk a bit more about that in terms of where I think the definition's taken us.
I think perhaps for people that maybe, you know, the definition's pretty new, or maybe it was 10 years ago and they've gotten a bit, maybe just talk a little bit to what's in the definition. And
yeah, sure. Well, I mentioned things like
oh, sorry, Tim, I was going to say, you mentioned that Australia is quite unique in having this definition, which I think is another thing that might be useful to talk about.
Yeah, sure. I don't know whether Katie can actually bring up the definition so everyone can see it. That'd be terrific if we could. But, you know, the key parts, as I already mentioned, things like empowerment, participation, human rights, the idea that young people are at the centre of the work. It's the central, if you like, commitment of youth workers, and their work is to young people. And that, what we were all agreed on that. There was little debate about that. The words that we used to describe that, there was lots of debate. And again, you'll see in the original document, you know, things like primary consideration, primary constituent, primary client, all of those, and they all had baggage, and they all had people that were advocating for those. In the end, we didn't choose any of those, which is interesting because all of those terms come out of various codes of ethics and things. We chose just to describe youth work as being, in, you know, its primary focus, if you like, being with the young person. So not on the employer, not on the family, even not on the state or the church or the law, you know, government, etc., but on the young person. So regardless of who is employing us or paying our salary, that our relationship, and again, that was a key term, is with the young person and working in their best interests. So, yeah, really important in relation to an absolutely unified agreement that was the starting point. And yes, it's unique. It is unique because there aren't similar definitions in the same way. Some countries do have definitional statements. Some of them are tied to codes of ethics. One of the things that's fascinated me over the last 10 years is how often our definition gets cited and quoted around the world. So I've been in forums like the Commonwealth of Nations, the Commonwealth Secretariat Youth Program, 53 countries of the Commonwealth, and our definition gets cited in those forums. European Youth Commission forums in Europe, across the countries of Europe, our definition gets cited. It appears in peer-reviewed academic literature. It appears in reports. I even noticed that it's in a New South Wales state government policy report refers to it, a recent one that's just come out. So, you know, it's become quite influential and gets cited, and which I think it means that it's worthwhile and it stood the test of time.
I agree with you that it was something, there was a bit of hype around it at the time, but it is something I think that as we revisit it, the importance of it is more obvious now. How do you think the definition of youth work, how do you think it addressed challenges faced by youth workers and influenced the public perception in Australia of youth workers? Has it had an impact in that sense?
Yes, I think so. And, you know, for those that were there at the time, and there were lots of us involved in the writing of it, you know, lots of people, you know, it wasn't just that one moment in the room. There was a lot leading up to it. So there's lots of authors in that sense. And in one sense, the sector nationally is the author, and, you know, AYAC is the custodian and been a fantastic custodian of it. But its influence, I think, is important. If you go back to those times, you know, there was a lot of debate about, well, what's the difference between a youth worker and a social worker, for instance? Isn't youth work just social work with young people? That was said all the time. And of course, there's a very clear distinction. Youth work is a degree qualification. There's also, you know, a diploma qualification taught through the TAFE system. There are many thousands and thousands of graduates in youth work that do youth work, right? And so for them, the professional identity, defining what it was really important, particularly when their employers are saying, well, why should I employ a youth worker? What's the difference with employing a social worker? You can say, well, this is what a youth worker is. This is what a youth worker does. Here's the agreed national definition of what youth work is. Really, really important. And it's amazing how many times over the years I've met youth workers, local government youth services or youth housing, doesn't matter where it is, saying, hey, guess what? I've had to take that definition into my manager's office and say, hey, this is what youth work is. It's not all these other things that we think, this is what youth work is. Mm-hmm. So, just being able to have this sort of conversation with funders, employers, managers, governments to say, hey, this is what it is. I think the other thing is about reassuring the public about what youth work was, because, as I said before, we went through this terrible period of the Royal Commissions where, and let's face it, there were lots of youth workers and people doing youth work who abused young people in their care. A terrible, appalling thing to have happened in our history. So again, having a statement that said, well, here it is, this is what it is, and we want to build on this and professionalise the sector to make sure this never happens again. Really important. And, the Youth Workers Association in various states, and now the National Professional Association, Youth Workers Australia, I think is, played a very important role building on that definition to professionalise the sector. Really important. The other thing is it's, of course, taught in all of the degree programs. So if you do a degree in youth work, there's curriculums built around the national definition. And so it's inherent to the curriculums and what's taught in the university programs and in the diplomas. So again, incredibly influential about, well, here it is. This is what's the agreed definition of youth work across Australia, that all of the state peaks have signed up to, etc., and the professional association. So again, the importance of that can't be underestimated.
Certainly from a perspective, I know that together with the Code of Ethics work, the definition was really useful in negotiating sort of contracts with the government and all of that sort of thing as well, and even just explaining, because there is that crossover, and not everywhere in Australia could you do a degree at that time, and even TAFE level courses were not an option. So being able to explain why is it important that we do have qualified youth workers.
Yeah, absolutely true. And look, an example of that is in 2020 when the Morrison government decided to change the funding of university education and create a tiered system, which meant that where those qualifications were in that tier made an incredible difference to students' HECS bills. And for youth work to be in a funding category that was highly subsidised, so that youth workers weren't having to pay huge amounts of money to do a youth work degree, we needed to convince the federal government that youth work was a real thing and was a professional qualification. And the definition was absolutely crucial to that. The fact that we had a professional association that had signed up to it, what is now Youth Workers Australia, was incredibly important to that process. And now we have those youth work courses being accredited by the professional association based on that federal government recognition, and then now receiving those subsidies. So just that outcome, being able to have that initial conversation with the federal government and then get that recognition, wouldn't have happened without the definition.
How do you think revisiting the current definition, and perhaps adding something like a practice framework or another resource to emphasise the educational foundation of youth work impact the education and readiness of youth work students? So if we're going to add to it, if we're going to change it, I don't necessarily think it needs to be changed, but if we're looking at ways we can enhance it, what benefits do you think there would be?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to say is lots changed in 10 years, and it'd be worth me mentioning a few of those. But before I do, I think the current definition is great. Could it be improved? I'm sure it could. What's the best way to do that? I think that's a discussion for another day, because I think that's a big one. I think, though, it would be quite easy to produce documents that sat around the current code that helped youth workers apply the code. So to think about, the definition. How would we use the definition in our practice, for instance? And could we write documents that would help the implementation of the definition into practice? What would that look like? So, for instance, I've written a paper recently about social pedagogy, or non-formal education. Really globally now, non-formal education is considered to be the primary practice framework of youth work. That is, that youth workers are educators in the broadest sense of that word, not in the sense of being a school teacher or, secondary or formal education, but seeing everything that a young person may learn or participate in their development outside of schooling is a part of non-formal education, and that youth workers are very much part of that process and facilitating that. That's not just me saying that. That's most of the peak organisations across the world. The Big Six have put out, the Big Six youth orgs have put out a statement saying that youth work is non-formal education. The Commonwealth Secretariat has done that. The European Youth Commission has done that. The UK NYA bodies have done that. So really, we would be out of step in Australia if we weren't thinking that youth work was a practice informed by non-formal education as one of its frameworks, for instance. So I think that would be worth considering. May not need to go into the definition statement, but it could be a document that sat around the definition. I think there's a lot that has changed, though. And, mental health issues for young people are now something that's widely recognised, widely funded by government. There's, climate change is a massive issue for young people and must be at the heart of what we do as youth workers. Issue-based work, poverty is still the biggest intersectional issue in Australia for young people, without doubt, in terms of limiting life chances. And then, of course, diversity as an issue for young people is incredibly important. So does the code need to say something to those things? And then how would it say it, I suppose, is the question.
Okay.
Sorry, the definition. Did I just say the code? The definition. I'm stuck in the code discussions at the moment from my state peak, but I mean the definition. Yeah.
All good. Yeah, I think that's something that we at AYAC are keen to explore perhaps further with you and with others about what can support the definition, so that we can, continue to have it as a living document that's utilised over time. But looking ahead, how do you envision the future of youth work in Australia? And I think you've touched on this a bit, and whether or not the current definition adequately captures the essence at the moment in this rapidly changing socio-cultural landscape. So you have kind of touched on it, but I'm just thinking in a broader sense, like what other factors are there? I think the cohort itself has changed. There's a lot more migrants perhaps than there was previously, and those sorts of things. So what other things do you think have changed around youth work practice itself?
Look, probably the biggest one is, child safe standards. Both the national standards for organisations that work with children and young people. There are also state-based standards. Every state has legislation now around safeguarding and safely working with young people, working with children checks, mandatory reporting. There is a range now of legislative frameworks that really impact and shape what we do as youth workers with young people. And I think, that needs to be recognised. There needs to be, at the very least, some documentation out of the definition that points to the legal frameworks and legal obligations and responsibilities that workers have now in their various states. That would be the number one for me. There's lots of others, as I mentioned before. The mental health of young people is a big issue. Climate change is a massive issue. Poverty is still the biggest intersectional issue, affecting the largest number of young people in terms of disadvantage, marginalisation. But there's a range of other issues. The voice of young people is still marginalised. Young people still don't have a vote under the age of 18. They don't have say, about the laws that are made about them. There's lots there's lots really that could sit around the definition.
I'm to get to some of the questions, Tim. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there with the sound. One of the questions that we've got that's come in, Tim, is around the human rights aspect of the definition. Can you talk more about why the realisation of rights was an important inclusion in the definition?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the supporting documents that sit around the definition, you'll see that there was a lot of conversation around that. And it was, in fact, Queensland and CFAS, who was part of that, and I see that he's in the chat, was supportive, as was Victoria and my position at the time. And you can see that in that dialogue document that sits around the code. And there were others that were concerned about that as a framework, but eventually, we all agreed that the rights of young people were important, and that youth workers, part of their job was to advocate for the rights of young people. And I think there would be very few people, I think, that would argue against that. Human rights at that time was being written into children's, youth and families legislation in most states. And I think now it is in almost every state's legislation, except I think Western Australia, where the human rights declarations, and particularly the Convention on the Rights of the Child, were written into legislation that was governing the work of youth workers and agencies that work with young people. So we were reflecting what was happening at that time. Also, human rights commissioners were quite vocal about the rights of young people, and particularly young people's right to a home, to shelter. The Burdekin report and what followed that as the Human Rights Commissioner around youth homelessness in Australia led to a huge reshaping of our sector and work with homeless young people. And so that, again, coming out of those commissioners for human rights in states and federally. So human rights declarations and charters, which have been signed into law by our federal governments and then by our state governments. The Victorian government at the time wrote its own charter of human rights and responsibilities that governs Victorians, and other states have now done that. The ACT very noticeably. Of course, the other thing that was happening in the rights space was that Kevin Rudd had been elected in 2007. The peak had been refunded. The Gillard had then become the Prime Minister during this whole period of the writing. And of course, as part of their policy platform, they'd committed to introducing a Bill of Rights. It didn't happen, but there was a process and a national discussion that was going on at the same time as we were thinking about the definition, about a national Bill of Rights. So yeah, that's really the background to that.
Mm-hmm. Another aspect of the definition, I've got a question around, so relationship is used in the definition of youth work, and how does the language choice shape youth work practice and professional identity? So that concept of relationship and what it is in youth work.
Yeah, I think that was foundational, and again, one of those concepts that most of us agreed on. I mean, you've got to remember there were very passionate people here, practitioners, academics, people that have been in the sector in administrative roles for a long period of time. And so everybody wanted their kind of perspective in the definition. And we had to sort of come to some agreement. And there was vocal disagreement. That's absolutely true. And even today, there are still people that would not be happy with some of the words that are used there. I mean, perhaps the principles or the concepts behind them we would agree on, but the words that we're using to describe them, there would still be people that would disagree. But I think relationship, again, in the literature on youth work, that is the global literature, the idea that youth workers have a connection with a young person and young people that is important to youth work is absolutely central, again, in the global literature. The word relationship is problematic, and I probably don't need to point that out to people why that is. And in the context of Royal Commissions into the Abuse of Children, when you say you're in a relationship with a young person, that's really problematic. But the idea that you have this important connection with a young person and young people that informs the youth work relationship, I think is central. Yeah.
These questions are interesting, I think. So it's come from John, and he said, in thinking about youth work as explicitly addressing injustice, how do we manage the political challenge of a definition that includes this when injustices are caused by government policy? What are your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an advocate for the inclusion of terms like social justice. Absolutely. I think that's important. You know, when I think about poverty and the reality that very, very large numbers of young people live in poverty, they're born into poverty, then I think social justice has to be a reality and has to be part of our work as youth workers. And there's an implicit structural critique in that. That means it's critiquing the structures of society, which includes the policies of government, the laws that governments make. But again, a reminder, who are governments? Well, governments are elected by us. They are essentially our representatives. It's a democratic process. So we are critiquing ourselves in the end.
Another aspect, just I guess pulling out bits and pieces from the definition as well, but one aspect is around the empowerment of young people, that being a focus in the definition. How important is this when most of the community, sadly, probably, view young people as vulnerable or dangerous? So that empowerment, what's the...
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think, again, the global literature would say that the empowerment of young people, the importance of young people having a voice, having a say in decisions that are being made about them, having agency over those decisions, is an incredibly important part of youth work, and advocating for that say. And of course, that's one of the crucial rights that young people have under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, is a right to have a say in decisions that are being made about them. So again, absolutely, I think the empowerment of young people is important at an individual level, but also at a collective level, at a social structural level. I think about climate change, and I think about climate change movements being led by young people, particularly, you know, if I think about the Friday strikes movement, you know, unbelievable empowerment of young people trying to make massive change, and doing the only thing that they can is withdrawing themselves from the school system in order to, you know, protest and make their point. My view is that youth work has to be supportive of those movements. It has to be part of those movements. It has to be there alongside young people, helping to facilitate and advocate for those movements. That, to me, is a definition of empowerment. And look, you know, if I was in a youth work class, I would draw a triangle and I'd say, well, empowerment and participation equals social justice. They are the three sides of that triangle. You cannot have social justice without young people's participation, and they will never be empowered unless they are enabled to participate. So participation, empowerment equals social justice.
On the topic of young people themselves, got a question from AYAC Vic Rural. They're keen to hear thoughts on the role of youth peer workers being recognised as part of the youth sector, and what possibilities this presents for a supported pathway into vocational education, youth work, or other related qualifications, as well as the benefits it can produce in the community, especially as part of a youth participation framework. Yeah,
and what a great question and comment. And I hope that's Derm from AYAC Vic Rural, because
it is Derm.
He does fantastic work in this space, and his team. Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely should be part of how we understand youth work, as working with young people, and that young people as peer workers should absolutely be part of that space. The lived experience of young people has to be recognised, should be recognised, and is absolutely valuable. And I think thinking about lived experience in a collective sense rather than just individualizing it is also important. Again, if I go back to thinking about poverty, poverty is the collective lived experience of a huge number of young people, and we've sort of stopped talking about poverty. It's got lost, and yet, it's one of the single biggest issues that will affect young people's life chances. And so I think, for peer workers whose lived experience is in that space, then they can assist and educate youth workers, absolutely, who are working in that space, without doubt. So, agree, Derm.
Another question, just posing really, wondering whether the influence and importance of the definition could be even greater if it was enshrined in legislation as well. Do you think we need a similar national agreement on the definition of youth work along those lines? Would that be something that we could look at changing?
Great question. And look, some countries have done this. The Republic of Ireland, for instance, does have a statement on youth work in legislation. Relatively recent, but again, quite important for them in Ireland, and has been quite important for the funding of youth work and the recognition of youth work in Ireland. So, yes, I think it's worthy of thinking about. Are there dangers? Well, yes, there are. Legislation is very hard to change once it's there. I went back recently and was looking at the original Youth Affairs Act in Victoria from the 1960s. And gee, it's a really interesting way of thinking about youth work that's sitting in that 1960s Act. And it looks very different to our current 2005 Children's, Youth and Families Act, right? So things change. And the problem with legislation, there's lots of benefits from legislating a definition, but there's also problems, and we'd want to be careful what we wish for. It can mean something is very hard to change. But worth thinking about, absolutely.
I'm going to touch on something now. So I want to sort of go back to the actual time of it happening and that sort of thing. And I think and there's people I'm sure that are online that were there or part of it discussions going a really long way back. So CVASH in Queensland has just commented around the long discussion that was had, and that Queensland has its own definition and didn't necessarily support the national definition because of a couple of key differences. I'm just wondering if you want to talk to that a little bit more.
Look, probably CVASH is the best person to talk to that. But yes, I mean, as I said before, there were those in the room that had a difference of opinion and a different perspective. And Queensland was one of those. And yes, they do have their own a definitional statement. Again, I think, were we ever going to get 100% unanimity across everything? No. Could we agree on, some fundamental principles and some concepts? I think we could. Were we still arguing about the words that we were using right up to the end, and probably still are? Yes, I think we are. Are we better off for having a definition 10 years on? Yes, absolutely. If 10 years ago we'd said, well, let's not do this, we can't agree, would we be worse off? Yes, absolutely, in my view. The benefits of our, what I would call a minimalist definition, have far outweighed what I think, are the sticking points in the words that we've used.
And the other aspect to that question that CVASH posed, I can't really answer. I'm not sure whether you can either, but I do remember at the time there was talk about potential revisions in the future, and CVASH says, what's happened to that? And I'm not actually sure, but we've been unfunded, funded, etc., etc. And this is, I guess, I feel like this conversation in itself, whilst we're really wanting to celebrate the fact that we even have a definition of any sort, it's also, opening up opportunities maybe to look at things or support them better, to how can we utilize them more in the future. But Tim, you might have more that you want to answer directly to, or have a conversation with
Well,
CBASH
yeah, look,
separately.
yeah. I mean, the short answer is there was no review because soon after it was published, the peak was defunded. And I mean, if people can remember back that far, you know, it was defunded by the Howard government. It was then refunded by the Rudd and Gillard governments. It was then defunded by the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments, and only now just refunded. So there was 10 years of an unfunded peak, of which many, many people put in countless volunteer hours to continue to make sure we had a peak operating, even though it was unfunded. I mean, Nadine Liddy, for me, you know, was one of those standout people who chaired it through the MyAN, and the fact that the MyAN continued to support the peak was just incredible through that period, right? Now, I've just named one person. There were lots of others, and I can name many, many more than Nadine. She's just one that came to mind. But, you know, I think that's why we haven't had a review. Is it time for a review? Yeah, I think it is. And good on you, Joe, for raising it and bringing it up. And I think that's, you know, absolutely AYAC's job to think about what that might look like, you know, how that would be undertaken, the sorts of things that you might want to look at. And I think maybe that's a next step, and, you know, maybe that's a survey that you put out to the sector or whatever. That's really up to you as AYAC to determine that. You're the custodians of the definition. So.
And we do intend, after this webinar finishes in the coming days, we will send out just a feedback survey where we are going to seek information about the appetite for being involved in further work, or even whether or not people think that's something we should pursue. But to another question, I'm just wondering, this is from Marty, whether the influence and importance of the definition could be even greater if, oh no, we've just asked that one. I'm sorry, I'm double reading now. Sorry, wrong one. This is the question I wanted. I do apologize. While we've made a lot of progress, you know, thanks to the definition and lots of people in the sector, and you know, other work that's happened as well, Greg's raised that we do still have a mountain to climb to increase the value of youth work to all various parties. In certain circles, the informal aspect of youth work is seen as a detriment and unprofessional, and not just in the informal approach. So there's a lot to do to allow us to advocate, empower, assist, and all those other things that we want to do through youth work. While the conceptual approaches are necessary, they don't always translate into the real world where things need to change, a mind or a heart, HR departments, managers, and so forth. Till then, our work is a bit hamstrung quite significantly. And how do we change that, Tim? It's a big question. I apologize.
Yeah. Do you want to just summarize that down into a short, what are you asking?
I think it's really that, I think what Greg's getting at too is that, yeah, a lot's happened, but, you know, there's a lot to do to show that value of youth.
And look, I agree. Yeah. And I think that's absolutely
what can we do? We're a little bit hamstrung while the community still thinks that. Definition's one tool. What can we do? Oh, yeah. And look, you know, in my state in Victoria, which is very hot today, by the way, I feel like I'm melting here. We've started to look at the economic value, right, of youth work. And I know that that'll be distasteful for some people, but our state governments and our welfare agencies that are funded by state governments are fixated on this idea of economic value. And so we sort of bit the bullet and said, well, okay, we're going to try and show the economic value of youth work as an evidence base to increase our funding. And that's been really useful. I note that in the Republic of Ireland, they did that some years ago, and again, has been very, very useful for them to show the economic value of youth work. So that's one way. I wanted to go back to an earlier comment there about, you know, you asked me about the relational nature of youth work, and I failed really to mention there that, of course, it's not just about the relationship of the youth worker and the young person. It's the relationship of young people themselves to each other, and their relationship with other young people, with their community, and with wider society.
that's absolutely crucial. So what we would call the social context of youth work, and that's inherent to youth work, right? To think, and again, it's this idea that it's not just, you know, work with an individual young person. It's not just case management or you know, supported referral. It's actually working with groups of young people in a community, in a social context. That's what makes it relational. Really, really important. And again, back to the value question, that's where the value is for me. You know, that's where I think trying to explain that to people is often difficult for them to understand, you know, outside of narrow kind of, again, case management numbers. You know, yeah, good conversation to have, and fantastic. Bring it on. Let's have it. How can we show the value of youth work? Yeah, what a great question. And yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of in the chat, there's certainly lots of conversation around the different aspects that picking up in the conversation, and then maybe there's more things I think to follow up in separately. I'm just wondering, Tim, whether you have any sort of last reflections around, like, what would you like to see happen next? Where would you like to see this heading, this conversation, this starting point again? The place where we're at now, AYAC's refunded.
Yeah, well, bring back
the
AYAC national conferences. That'd be fantastic. That'd be good, because that'd be a place where we could continue these sorts of conversations, right? I'd love to be in a room with Siavash having these conversations all over again, right? That would be fantastic.
I might just stay outside. Yeah.
Whether that's informal or formal, right?
Yeah.
But I think just the chance for us to network and reconnect and to continue these discussions is really important. It's about our development as a sector, right? So yeah, AYAC National Conference, fantastic. I think more specifically, you know, people that might be interested in doing some work around how to apply the definition and in what ways. So if youth work is educational, there's an educational frame to youth work practice, non-formal education, or social pedagogy as it's called. What does that look like? How would you use the definition in the context of that sort of framework of practice? Now, that to me that's a think tank. That's a group of people getting together and going, oh, let's see how this works, and let's trial this in practice, and then let's write something up. And that could sit around, that could be a series of resources that, you know, AYAC have on their website. I know a number of the state peaks already do this, but you know, that to me would be a natural sort of progression to think about some resources that would assist youth workers in their practice use the definition.
I agree. I think that having been to past AYAC conferences, they were really valuable in that networking and just information sharing across, because obviously not all the states and territories have peaks or at different times, and certainly not as a national peak. So it is something that we're really keen to do. And just from an AYAC perspective, sitting in the hot seat at the moment, I can certainly feel like there's a lot of goodwill towards the organisation and wanting us to do well. And so I do really appreciate the support of, you know, people coming along to this, our first event, as we sort of find our feet again and support us through that. And I'm really keen to get as much participation from the sector when we take those next steps as well. Tim, thank you for your insightful reflections and for guiding us through the journey a little bit. I don't know that you really gave us the true flavour of the room that day, or at least my memory of it, which was a little bit like watching a tennis match, you know, one side to the other. And it probably sounds a bit crazy if you weren't there, but it really was quite a day. And I'm glad I was in that room to be part of that. And I think you're right, it does, as time has gone on, the value of it has probably grown. But yes, there is work we can do to revisit, to build on it, and just to utilise it more. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on the impact of the definition. Your knowledge and passion have made this, I feel, quite enriching session to start this conversation. And there's lots to talk about, lots to contemplate regarding meaningful youth work in Australia and what's next for the sector. I also want to extend my gratitude to all of the attendees across Australia who've joined us online today and contributed to the conversation. Your engagement and participation is really invaluable. And certainly as this is the first in a series of events for us, I am really appreciative of you making the time and seeing value in this. And I hope that continues. We're going to invite you, as I mentioned, to share your feedback and thoughts on today's discussion via survey that will be sent to you in the coming weeks. We'd really appreciate your input into this survey as we're starting afresh. And as we collectively reflect not just on the past 10 years and look ahead to any potential steps for the definition, but more broadly thinking about the work of AYAC and opportunities for sessions like today. But thank you for joining us for our first Spotlight Series session. Have a good day. Thanks.